March 15th, 1814, and the rain had not ceased for 3 hours, drumming against the windows of Thornhill Manor with a persistence that matched the ache in Eleanor Ashworth's temples as she made her way through the darkened corridor of the east wing, a single candle clutched in her trembling fingers, while hot wax dripped slowly onto her sleeve, marking the grey wool of her only good dress with pale spots she would have to scrape away come morning. Lady Pemberton needed her tonic, the one the physician had prescribed for her cough, and Eleanor had been directed to the medicine cabinet in what she had been told was the third door on the left, though the shadows played tricks in this unfamiliar house, and she had already tried 2 doors that led to nothing but empty sitting rooms filled with furniture draped in holland covers like ghosts waiting for guests who might never arrive. At 26 years old, Eleanor had long since accepted her place in the margins of such gatherings, invisible to the lords and ladies who swept past her in their silks and jewels while she tended to her elderly employer's needs, fetching shawls and preparing tisanes, and pretending not to hear the whispered remarks about spinsters and plain faces, and women who had missed their chance at anything resembling a real life. The third door, she told herself, lifting the candle higher, though its flame guttered in some unseen draught, and she pressed the handle down and stepped inside, before her tired mind registered the warmth of a fire still burning in the grate, the rich smell of brandy, and something else, something perfumed and wrong, and then the scene before her crystallized into horrifying clarity. A man sprawled across rumpled bedsheets, his shirt open to the waist, and a lazy smile spreading across features that society called devastatingly handsome, while beside him a woman Eleanor recognized as Lady Ashton, wife to a baron twice her age, clutched the coverlet to her bare shoulders with a gasp that seemed to echo forever in the suddenly silent room. Thomas Sinclair, younger brother to the Duke of Ravenscroft, and rake of considerable reputation, merely laughed at Eleanor's frozen expression, the sound careless and cruel as he waved one elegant hand in dismissal. "Well, well, what have we here?" he drawled. Some little grey mouse come to join the festivities, and Eleanor could not move, could not speak, could not do anything but stand rooted to the spot with wax pooling now against her wrist in a burn she barely felt. And then the door behind her burst open with a force that sent her stumbling forward, and she turned to face a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire room, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and darker eyes that swept the scene before him and settled finally, devastatingly, upon her. Frederick Sinclair, the Duke of Ravenscroft himself, had come looking for his wayward brother, and what he found instead was Eleanor Ashworth standing at the foot of a bed of sin candle. In hand, and in his cold gaze, she watched herself be judged, condemned, and dismissed in the space of a single damning heartbeat. 20 minutes later, Eleanor stood before the dying fire in Thornhill Manor's library, her hands clasped so tightly before her that she could feel her own heartbeat pulsing against her interlaced fingers, while the Duke of Ravenscroft paced the length of the room like some caged predator, his boots striking the parquet floor with each measured step as though he were counting out the rhythm of her disgrace. She had followed him here at his cold command, issued in the hallway outside that terrible bedchamber where Thomas Sinclair's laughter still seemed to echo in her ears, and now she waited while he gathered whatever cruel words he intended to deliver, her grey dress with its damning wax stain feeling suddenly like the uniform of her shame. "I can explain," she began, her voice emerging smaller than she had intended, and he turned on her with such swift contempt that she actually stepped backward, nearly stumbling against a table upon which sat a worn volume of poetry that she noticed with the strange clarity of a mind desperate to focus on anything but the present moment. "Explain," he repeated, and the word dripped with aristocratic disdain. as though the very notion that a woman caught in such circumstances might possess an explanation worthy of his attention was beneath consideration. Women who frequent gentlemen's bedchambers at midnight require no explanation, Miss Ashworth, for their purposes are abundantly clear to anyone with eyes and the smallest understanding of human nature, and I confess myself astonished only that my brother's taste has descended to such. He paused, his dark eyes travelling over her plain face and plainer dress. Such unremarkable quarry. The words struck her like physical blows, each one landing precisely where it would wound most deeply, and Eleanor felt the hot press of tears behind her eyes, even as something else rose within her, something that felt remarkably like anger at the injustice of being condemned without trial by a man who knew nothing of her circumstances. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steadier now, though she could feel a single tear escaping down her cheek. "I was seeking medicine for my employer, Lady Pemberton, whose cough has troubled her greatly, and I entered that room by mistake, in a darkened corridor of an unfamiliar house, and that is the truth, whether you choose to believe it or not." She watched something flicker across his stern features, something that might have been surprise at her composure, or perhaps merely irritation at her presumption in speaking at all, and from somewhere above them came the muffled sound of Thomas's careless laughter, drifting down through the floorboards like a mocking commentary on her predicament. Frederick Sinclair's jaw tightened at the sound, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might say something more, might ask a question or acknowledge the possibility of error, but instead he simply gestured toward the door with one aristocratic hand. "You may go," he said, his voice flat with dismissal, and Eleanor drew herself up to her full, if unremarkable height, meeting his eyes for one long moment in which she refused to let him see how deeply his judgment had cut. She turned and walked to the door, her practical shoes silent on the carpet, and she did not look back, though she felt his gaze following her, and something in the quality of his attention suggested that, perhaps, just perhaps, she had not responded quite as he had expected, and that small victory would have to be enough to carry her through the long, sleepless night ahead. The morning of March 16th, 1814, arrived with grey light filtering through rain-streaked windows, and Eleanor Ashworth descended the stairs to the breakfast-room at Thornhill Manor, wearing the same grey wool dress she had worn the night before, the pale wax stain still visible on her sleeve like a badge of her humiliation, because she possessed no other garment suitable for company, and had spent the sleepless hours before dawn alternately weeping into her pillow and scrubbing uselessly at the mark with cold water from her wash-basin. Lady Pemberton had required her tonic twice more during the night, her cough rattling through the thin walls of their adjoining chambers, and Eleanor had administered the medicine with hands that trembled only slightly, grateful for the distraction of duty, even as her mind replayed the Duke of Ravenscroft's contemptuous dismissal in an endless, torturous loop. Now she paused at the threshold of the breakfast-room, hearing the clink of china and the murmur of conversation within, and she drew one long breath before entering to face whatever fresh mortification awaited her among the assembled guests. The whispers began before she had taken 3 steps into the room, a subtle rustling like wind through autumn leaves, and she kept her eyes fixed on the sideboard, where covered dishes steamed gently in the grey morning light, while she felt the weight of a dozen curious stares pressing against her skin. Lady Constance Greville sat near the window in peacock blue silk, her distinctive laugh ringing out with theatrical clarity as she leaned toward her neighbour to murmur something behind her fan, and Eleanor did not need to hear the words to know their subject. At the head of the table, the Duke of Ravenscroft sat with a cup of black coffee before him, his dark eyes shadowed, as though he too had passed a restless night. And when Eleanor entered, he looked up with an expression she could not read, something that might have been irritation, or perhaps something more complicated flickering across his stern features, before he returned his attention to his plate. "My dear girl," Lady Pemberton called out with innocent cheerfulness, patting the empty chair beside her. "There you are at last, and I must thank you again for fetching my medicine last night, for I know you had some difficulty finding the right room in that dark corridor." The words fell into a sudden pool of silence, and Eleanor watched Frederick Sinclair's coffee cup pause halfway to his lips as the implications of her employer's statement registered, his dark gaze cutting toward Eleanor with something that looked almost like the dawning of doubt. From across the room, Thomas Sinclair lounged in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for anything in his privileged life, and his voice carried clearly when he drawled, "Yes, indeed, Miss Ashworth does seem to have a talent for finding herself in unexpected places at unexpected hours, does she not?" And the veiled mockery in his tone made Eleanor flinch despite her best efforts at composure, a small involuntary movement that Frederick witnessed with narrowing eyes and a tightening jaw that suggested, perhaps for the first time, that his certainty about the events of last night had begun to crack. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The entrance hall of Thornhill Manor bustled with the organized chaos of departure as servants carried trunks and bandboxes past the tall windows where weak March sunlight struggled through clouds that threatened more rain, and Eleanor Ashworth stood beside Lady Pemberton's modest but well-maintained carriage, her worn leather gloves gripping the door handle as she helped her elderly employer navigate the steps while trying desperately to ignore the prickling awareness that told her she was being watched from somewhere within the grand doorway. Lady Pemberton's cough had worsened overnight, a rattling sound that worried Eleanor far more than any social disgrace, and she tucked the green shawl more securely around the older woman's shoulders before turning to arrange the cushions inside the carriage, grateful for the excuse to hide her face from whatever curious or condemning eyes might be observing her final moments at this place she wished never to see again. She had almost succeeded in believing she might escape without further incident when the sound of boots on gravel made her stiffen, and she did not need to turn around to know that the Duke of Ravenscroft had approached, his presence announcing itself in the sudden tension that ran down her spine like ice water. "Your ladyship," Frederick Sinclair's voice came from behind her, formal and correct. "I trust your journey home will be comfortable, and I must apologize that your stay was not all that it should have been." Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the carriage interior as Lady Pemberton responded with cheerful obliviousness. "Oh, Your Grace, we had a perfectly lovely time, and I do so look forward to our visit to Ravenscroft Hall this summer, for my dear late husband always spoke so highly of the Derbyshire countryside, and Miss Ashworth reads to me so beautifully that I am certain we shall enjoy exploring your magnificent library." The mention of the summer visit struck Eleanor like a blow, and she could not prevent her sharp intake of breath or the visible stiffening of her shoulders, and when she finally forced herself to turn and curtsy to the Duke, she kept her gaze fixed firmly on the signet ring that gleamed on his hand, the family crest catching the pale light as he stood there in his dark coat, looking somehow different than he had the night before, less certain, almost troubled. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and something in his voice made her finally lift her eyes to his face where she saw him studying her worn gloves, her single grey dress with its telltale stain, the careful dignity with which she held herself despite possessing nothing, no family, no fortune, no protector, but a kind elderly woman who did not even know she needed protecting. She watched him struggle with something, perhaps an apology that his pride would not permit, and for one long moment their eyes held, while around them servants loaded the last of the baggage, and Thomas Sinclair's carriage rattled past without stopping, its occupant carefully avoiding his brother's notice. "I hope," Frederick began, then stopped, his jaw tightening, and Eleanor simply curtsied again with all the composure she could muster. "Your Grace," she said, and climbed into the carriage without looking back, though she felt his gaze following them down the long drive until the manor house disappeared behind the trees and she could finally release the breath she had been holding. The 2 weeks that followed their departure from Thornhill Manor passed with excruciating slowness for Eleanor Ashworth, each day bringing fresh evidence that the whispers born in that Hampshire breakfast room had followed her back to London like a persistent shadow she could neither outrun nor shake, and by late March the spring rains had returned to streak the windows of Lady Pemberton's modest townhouse, while Eleanor sat in Mrs. Hartwell's overcrowded parlour wearing the new blue dress her employer had gifted her just last week, a kindness that now felt almost cruel as she watched the other women in the room exchange glances and shift their chairs imperceptibly, away from where she perched alone near the cold fireplace. Lady Constance Greville had arrived 20 minutes earlier in a swirl of expensive perfume and barely concealed malice, her distinctive laugh ringing out with theatrical frequency as she held court among the assembled ladies and steered the conversation with the precision of a general directing troops toward battle. And Eleanor knew with sick certainty that she was the target when Lady Greville's voice carried clearly across the room, declaring that one simply could not be too careful these days about the character of those one admitted to polite society, for there were women who presented themselves as respectable companions while conducting themselves in ways that would make a courtesan blush. The other ladies tittered behind their teacups, while Eleanor sat motionless with her hands folded in her lap and her face carefully blank, though inside she felt each word like the cut of a blade. And the worst of it was that she could not defend herself without exposing the married woman she had stumbled upon in Thomas Sinclair's bed, a woman who had 3 children and a husband who trusted her, and who would be ruined far more thoroughly than Eleanor herself if the full truth emerged. Rain streaked down the windows overlooking the cobblestone street, where carriages splashed through puddles and coal smoke hung heavy in the damp air, and Eleanor fixed her gaze on that grey vista, while Mrs. Hartwell pointedly failed to offer her a second cup of tea, and the youngest Miss Bertram actually rose and moved to a seat farther across the room, as though scandal might be catching like a winter cold. When Lady Pemberton's carriage finally arrived to collect her, Eleanor descended the townhouse steps with her spine straight and her chin high, despite the trembling in her hands, and she maintained that composure throughout the silent ride home and through the front door and up the stairs to her small chamber, where she finally allowed herself to sink onto the bed and press her fists against her eyes until the urge to weep had passed, because she would not give Lady Greville the satisfaction even in private. That evening Lady Pemberton called Eleanor to her sitting room, where a fire crackled against the chill and a letter lay open on the side table. Her employer's kind face creased with concern as she patted the seat beside her and asked gently whether something had happened to distress her dear girl. And Eleanor smiled and deflected and insisted that nothing was wrong, while her heart ached with the impossibility of explaining. And then Lady Pemberton coughed that rattling cough that had grown so much worse these past weeks, and mentioned almost casually that the invitation to Ravenscroft Hall had arrived at last, and they would depart for Derbyshire within the fortnight. And Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, as she realized she would have to face Frederick Sinclair again after all. The journey from London to Derbyshire took 3 long days of rattling over roads that the spring thaw had transformed into rivers of mud, and Eleanor Ashworth spent every mile attending to Lady Pemberton's comfort, while her own thoughts churned with dread at what awaited them at the end of this interminable trek. For no matter how many times she adjusted the cushions behind her employer's back, or tucked the beloved green shawl more securely around those frail shoulders, or measured out doses of the tonic the physician had prescribed for that terrible, rattling cough, she could not escape the knowledge that each turn of the carriage, Wheels brought her closer to facing the Duke of Ravenscroft, and the cold contempt she had seen in his eyes that awful night at Thornhill Manor. Lady Pemberton dozed against the squabs, with the innocent peace of someone who had no idea that her companion's reputation lay in tatters, her white hair escaping its pins and her breathing laboured even in sleep. And Eleanor watched her with a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with the fact that this kind woman was the closest thing to family she had left in the world, and she would endure Frederick Sinclair's scorn 1,000 times over rather than burden Lady Pemberton with the truth of what had happened or why London society had suddenly grown so cold. The small trunk of books Eleanor had packed sat wedged beneath her feet, its familiar weight a comfort she clung to as the countryside rolled past the rain-spattered windows, green fields giving way to rolling hills and stone walls and villages where they stopped to change horses and where Eleanor made certain Lady Pemberton had hot tea and a warm room to rest in before they continued onward into the gathering dusk. Her memories of that March night played behind her eyes like a fever dream she could not shake. The guttering candle in her trembling hand, the shocked tableau in Thomas Sinclair's bedchamber, and then the Duke's face materializing from the shadows with an expression of such withering disgust that even now, weeks later, she felt her cheeks burn with the humiliation of it, and she pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the carriage window and watched her breath fog the view of passing hedgerows while she tried to prepare herself for whatever fresh mortification awaited her at Ravenscroft Hall. The coachman, a steady man named Peters, who had served Lady Pemberton for 15 years, observed through the journey how Miss Ashworth never complained about the jolting roads or the cramped quarters, how she ate little, so that Lady Pemberton might have the choicest portions at inn tables, how she stayed awake through the night when her ladyship's cough grew worse and did not rest until the older woman slept peacefully, and these observations would find their way to the household staff at Ravenscroft, as such things always did among servants who knew the true measure of character. When at last the carriage crested a hill in the golden light of late afternoon on the third day, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Ravenscroft Hall rising from its parkland like something from a dream, all honey-coloured stone and gleaming windows and gardens where spring flowers were just beginning to unfurl their petals, she felt her breath catch, despite herself, at the sheer magnificence of it, and for one treacherous moment she forgot to be afraid and simply stared in wonder at what human hands had wrought from stone and glass and centuries of careful tending. The carriage wheels crunched to a halt on the gravelled drive as the last golden rays of sunset painted Ravenscroft Hall in shades of amber and rose, and Eleanor Ashworth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she peered through the window at the magnificent facade before her, all those gleaming windows reflecting the dying light like dozens of watchful eyes, and she braced herself for the cold reception she knew must await her within those walls where the Duke of Ravenscroft would surely greet Lady Pemberton with all proper courtesy, while cutting Eleanor dead with that same withering contempt she remembered from Thornhill Manor. But when the footman opened the carriage door and she stepped down to assist her employer, she found herself confronting a scene so unexpected that for a moment she wondered if the exhaustion of travel had caused her to hallucinate, for there on the marble steps stood Frederick Sinclair himself, not waiting in some grand receiving room, as befitted his station, but actually descended to meet them in person, his tall figure immaculate in a dark blue coat that matched the deepening sky. And beside him stood a woman of middle years with silver keys jangling at her waist, and a face that held none of the judgment Eleanor had steeled herself to endure. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton exclaimed with genuine pleasure, as Frederick stepped forward to hand her down from the carriage with a solicitude that seemed almost gentle, "we are so grateful for your hospitality." And he replied that the gratitude was entirely his before turning. And this was the moment Eleanor had dreaded, turning to face her directly with those grey eyes that had haunted her dreams for weeks. But instead of contempt, she saw something else there, something that looked almost like uncertainty, and when he spoke her name it was with a correctness that startled her. "Miss Ashworth, I trust your journey was not too taxing," and she managed to respond with a curtsy and a murmured assurance that the roads had been tolerable, all while her mind raced to understand what game he might be playing with this unexpected courtesy. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, the housekeeper, came forward with a warm smile that reached her eyes and welcomed them both to Ravenscroft Hall with a sincerity that seemed genuine. And as she led Eleanor inside while another servant attended to Lady Pemberton, Eleanor found herself passing beneath a soaring entrance hall where marble floors gleamed and family portraits gazed down from walls that had witnessed centuries of Sinclair history, a grand staircase sweeping upward into shadows that the candles were just beginning to push back as evening settled over the estate. "Your room is just this way, Miss Ashworth," Mrs. Whitmore said as they climbed the stairs, and Eleanor expected to be led toward the servants' quarters in some distant wing. But instead the housekeeper stopped before a door in the guest corridor and opened it to reveal a chamber that made Eleanor catch her breath, blue curtains framing windows that overlooked the garden where spring flowers were closing their petals against the coming night, a bed with fresh linens, a writing desk, a fireplace where a cheerful blaze already crackled, and she turned to Mrs. Whitmore with confusion plain on her face, because this was a room for a guest of consequence, not a paid companion, but the housekeeper merely smiled and said that His Grace had been quite specific about the arrangements, and something in her knowing expression suggested that Eleanor Ashworth had become a subject of considerable interest in this household. Sleep had eluded Eleanor Ashworth entirely that first night at Ravenscroft Hall, her mind too full of questions about the Duke's inexplicable courtesy, and the fine room she had been given, and what game he might be playing with her dignity. And so, when the first pale light of dawn crept through the blue curtains, she abandoned any pretense of rest, and dressed quietly in her simplest morning dress, pinning her hair loosely in a style that would have scandalized any proper lady's maid, and slipped out into the silent corridors to explore this magnificent house, while its inhabitants still slumbered, her feet carrying her down the grand staircase and through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced Sinclairs, until she found herself standing before a set of double doors that she pushed open to reveal a library, so beautiful it stole her breath entirely. 2 stories of books rising toward a ceiling painted with clouds and muses, a rolling ladder of polished brass and mahogany, leather chairs positioned near windows that flooded the space with the clear golden light of an April morning. And she stepped inside with the reverent hush of someone entering a cathedral, her fingers reaching out to touch the spine of a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets before she remembered herself, and snatched her hand back as though burned. "You may touch them," a voice said from somewhere behind her, and Eleanor spun to find Frederick Sinclair rising from one of the leather chairs where he had apparently been sitting unnoticed, and the sight of him made her heart stutter, because he was not the imposing Duke she remembered from that terrible night at Thornhill Manor, not in his shirt-sleeves with his cravat loosened and shadows beneath his grey eyes that suggested his own sleep had been equally troubled, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the sun-dappled space, until he gestured toward the shelves and said that the library was at her disposal during her stay, that she should feel free to borrow whatever volumes interested her, and Eleanor heard herself thanking him in a voice that came out cooler than she intended, a voice that belonged to the woman who had walked out of that other library with her head held high, despite the tears streaming down her face. "Miss Ashworth," he began, and something in his tone made her stiffen because she recognized the shape of what was coming, the apology he thought would absolve him, and she could not bear to hear him speak of that night in this beautiful room that had momentarily made her forget her humiliation, so she cut him off with a quick shake of her head and said that whatever he wished to say about their previous encounter was unnecessary, that the matter was forgotten, that she had no desire to revisit unpleasantness, and she watched his jaw tighten and something flicker in his eyes that might have been frustration or might have been respect, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement, even as his gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her loosely pinned hair and her plain dress, and all the ways she must appear to a man accustomed to polished society beauties. And Eleanor realized with a small shock that Frederick Sinclair had just discovered that winning her forgiveness would not be as simple as offering pretty words in a pretty room, and she was not entirely certain whether she was pleased or terrified by the determination she saw settling into his features. The 3 days that followed that morning encounter in the library passed in a strange dance of avoidance and awareness, Eleanor deliberately timing her movements through Ravenscroft Hall to minimize any chance of encountering the Duke alone, while simultaneously finding her thoughts drifting toward him at the most inconvenient moments, wondering what book he might be reading, whether he took his coffee in the library or his study, whether he thought of her at all, or had already dismissed her coolness as the ingratitude of a woman who ought to be flattered by any attention from a man of his station. And she had almost convinced herself that she could survive the remainder of Lady Pemberton's visit in this state of careful invisibility when April 7th arrived and brought with it a parade of carriages carrying guests for what Mrs. Whitmore had described as an extended house party. And Eleanor watched from the window of her blue-curtained room as elegant ladies and gentlemen descended onto the gravel drive below, their laughter carrying up to her ears like the chattering of exotic birds. And her heart sank further with each new arrival until it plummeted entirely when she recognized the distinctive peacock feathers adorning the hair of Lady Constance Greville, and behind her, stepping down from a separate carriage with all the careless grace of a man who had never suffered consequences for anything in his life, came Thomas Sinclair in a waistcoat so brilliantly embroidered it seemed to mock his brother's perpetual restraint. Eleanor, dressed in her blue dress, the finest thing she owned thanks to Lady Pemberton's generosity, and descended to the formal drawing-room where the guests had assembled beneath walls of yellow silk and the stern gaze of the late Duke's portrait, and she tried to make herself small in a corner near her employer's chair, tried to become invisible the way she had learned to do at 100 such gatherings, but Thomas found her within minutes, his smile sharp as broken glass as he offered her a bow that was just mocking enough to sting without being overt enough to call out, "Miss Ashworth." He drawled, "What an unexpected pleasure to find you here." And she felt Frederick's gaze snap toward them from across the room, even as she murmured something polite and meaningless in response. And Lady Greville's distinctive laugh rang out somewhere behind her, and Eleanor felt the walls of the beautiful yellow room closing in around her as the old humiliation rose fresh in her throat. Then Frederick was there, materializing at her side with a purposefulness that parted the crowd like water, and he was asking her opinion on the state of the gardens this spring, whether she had found the early roses to her liking, speaking to her as though her thoughts on flowers were the most fascinating subject imaginable. And Eleanor saw the surprise ripple through the room, saw Thomas's eyes narrow and Lady Greville's feathers quiver with interest, and she answered him with what she hoped was composure, while her heart hammered against her ribs, understanding with sudden clarity that the Duke of Ravenscroft had just declared to his assembled guests that Miss Eleanor Ashworth was worthy of his attention, and she did not know whether to feel protected or more exposed than ever. The formal dinner that evening was an exercise in endurance that Eleanor had perfected over years of sitting at tables where she did not quite belong, and she took her place near the foot of the long mahogany expanse with its gleaming silver candelabras and the Sinclair family china that bore the ducal crest in delicate blue and gold, and she kept her eyes fixed on her plate of turtle soup as conversations flowed around her in currents that deliberately excluded her, the young heiress beside her turning a shoulder so complete it might as well have been a wall, and from her position she could see Frederick at the head of the table, with Lady Pemberton placed at his right hand, in a gesture of courtesy that warmed Eleanor's heart, even as it highlighted her own lowly station, and she watched him speak attentively to her employer, watched Lady Pemberton's face light up at whatever he was saying, and she thought perhaps she had misjudged him entirely that terrible night at Thornhill Manor, or perhaps he was simply a man of contradictions too complex for her to untangle, and she was so lost in these thoughts that she almost missed Lady Greville's voice cutting through the genteel murmur of dinner conversation with the precision of a well-aimed arrow. "It is such a peculiar fashion these days," Lady Greville announced to the table at large, while her peacock feathers trembled with malicious delight, for hostesses to seat companions among proper guests, rather than allowing them to take their meals in their rooms, as was done in more sensible times. And surely it must be uncomfortable for everyone involved, the companions most of all, to be placed so far above their natural station, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burn as several guests turned to look at her with expressions ranging from pity to amusement, and she reached for her wine-glass, only to set it down again after the barest sip, because she would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her seek courage in drink. "I find," Frederick's voice rang out from the head of the table with a clarity that silenced every other conversation, "that those who work honestly for their living often possess more genuine worth than those who have never had to earn anything beyond the accident of their birth, and that any hostess of true breeding would recognize that character, not circumstance, determines fitness for good company." And Eleanor's gaze flew to his face to find him looking directly at Lady Greville with eyes like winter frost, and the silence that followed his words was so profound that Eleanor could hear the candle flames flickering in their silver holders. And then Lady Pemberton began to cough, that terrible rattling cough that had grown worse over the past weeks, and Eleanor was on her feet instantly, moving to her employer's side with a glass of water and a steady hand on her back. And she did not see the way Frederick's expression softened as he watched her tend to the old woman with such unconscious grace, did not see Thomas observing his brother's face with narrowed eyes and a smile that promised nothing good. She saw only Lady Pemberton's grateful squeeze of her fingers and knew that whatever else happened at this house party, she had at least one person in this room who valued her for exactly who she was. The morning of April 9th dawned bright and clear, with the kind of spring sunshine that seemed determined to coax every growing thing from its winter slumber, and Eleanor had escaped the suffocating atmosphere of the house party by slipping into the gardens before most of the guests had risen, telling herself she simply needed air and exercise rather than admitting she was fleeing the confusion that had taken root in her chest ever since Frederick's defense of her at dinner 2 nights prior, and she walked among the rose bushes where tight buds promised blooms that had not yet arrived, their green casings split just enough to hint at the red and pink and white that would soon unfurl. And she was so lost in contemplation of one particularly promising bud that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path until a liver and white spaniel came bounding around the hedge and pressed its wet nose against her worn leather gloves, and she looked up to find Frederick standing there in the morning light with an expression she could not quite read, and before she could curtsy or murmur an excuse to leave, he had fallen into step beside her, as though they had planned this meeting, his dog Caesar trotting happily between them as they walked in silence past beds of early tulips and the bound stone fountain where water splashed musically into its basin. "You rise early, Miss Ashworth," he said at last, and she replied that Lady Pemberton's needs often required early hours and the habit had become fixed, and he nodded as though this small detail about her life genuinely interested him. And then he asked about her history before Lady Pemberton, the question so unexpected that she answered honestly before she could think to deflect, telling him of her father, the country clergyman, and her mother who had taught her to love books, both taken by fever when she was 16, and the elderly benefactor who had paid for her education before his own death left her with nothing but knowledge and no means to use it. And Frederick listened with an attention that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced in years. They had reached a stone bench in a quiet corner of the garden, and he gestured for her to sit, settling beside her with enough distance to be proper, but close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of burdens carried. And when she asked how he found the duties of his new position, he surprised her by admitting that the dukedom had never been meant for him, that his elder brother had died 3 years ago, and his father only last winter, that he had spent his life preparing to be a second son, and now found himself responsible for estates and tenants and a legacy he had never sought. And Eleanor heard in his voice the same loneliness she carried in her own heart, the same sense of being thrust into a role that did not quite fit. And when their eyes met over Caesar's hopeful head, she felt something shift between them, some wall beginning to crumble. And she thought perhaps she understood now why he had judged her so harshly that night at Thornhill Manor, a man so unprepared for his own life that he clung to rigid rules as a drowning man clings to wreckage, and the understanding made her anger soften into something far more dangerous. The week that followed their morning in the garden passed in a rhythm that Eleanor scarcely dared acknowledge, each day bringing small moments of connection that accumulated like raindrops filling a vessel she had thought long empty. And by the evening of April 16th, the library had become their sanctuary, a place where the rigid boundaries of rank and propriety seemed to dissolve in the warm glow of firelight and the shared love of words. And she found herself there again as the clock struck 11, her hair loosened from its pins and falling around her shoulders because she had not expected to encounter anyone at this hour, had not admitted even to herself that she came here each night hoping he would appear. And when Frederick entered carrying a slim leather volume, she felt her heart perform that treacherous leap it had learned over these past days, and he smiled at her with a warmth that transformed his stern features into something approaching tenderness as he settled into the chair, across from hers while rain began to tap against the windows in a pattern that echoed the night they had first met under such different circumstances. They talked for hours, as had become their habit, of Shakespeare and Milton and the philosophers whose ideas she had absorbed during her years of education, and Frederick listened to her opinions with genuine interest, rather than the condescension she had learned to expect from gentlemen who believed women incapable of serious thought. And when she argued that Wordsworth's nature poetry spoke more truthfully to the human condition than the classical forms he preferred, he laughed and conceded her point with a grace that made her chest ache with wanting things she could not name. It was nearly midnight when he reached into his coat and withdrew the leather volume, and Eleanor recognized it immediately because she had seen it on the library table at Thornhill Manor that terrible night, a collection of verse that she had been too distracted by humiliation to examine closely, and Frederick's voice was rough as he explained that he had taken it without thinking, that he had found himself reading it in the weeks after that night, and remembering the way she had stood with such dignity despite her tears, that each poem had made him think of her until he could no longer separate the verses from the memory of her face. "I wanted you to have it," he said, and his hand moved toward hers where it rested on the arm of her chair, his fingers hovering so close she could feel the heat of them, and Eleanor's breath caught as she looked up to meet his eyes and saw there something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. And just as his fingertips brushed against her knuckles, a door slammed somewhere in the distant reaches of the house, and they both startled apart like guilty children, and she clutched the poetry book to her chest as she rose and murmured her good nights. And she did not see Thomas retreating into the shadows of the corridor with a satisfied smile, did not know that her happiness had been observed and marked for destruction by a man who could not bear to see his brother possess anything he himself could not have. The afternoon of April 20th found the drawing-room filled with the languid chatter of house guests who had nothing better to do than observe one another and catalogue every glance and gesture for later dissection. And Eleanor sat near the window with the poetry book Frederick had given her resting in her lap, its leather cover warm beneath her fingers as she tried to focus on the verses within rather than the way her heart lifted each time he entered a room, and she was so absorbed in this effort at self-control that she did not notice Thomas approaching until his shadow fell across the page, and his voice, smooth as honey poured over broken glass, murmured that she seemed quite attached to that particular volume, and when she looked up, his handsome face wore an expression of such false concern that her stomach tightened with instinctive warning, and he seated himself beside her without invitation, close enough that propriety strained at its seams, while across the room Lady Greville watched with the avid attention of a hawk spotting movement in the grass below, and Thomas leaned closer still, his breath carrying the faint sourness of wine consumed too early in the day, and he whispered that he felt compelled to warn her as a gentleman and a friend that his brother had a habit of amusing himself with women who could not afford to refuse his attentions, that Frederick collected conquests like other men collected snuff boxes and discarded them with equal indifference once the novelty faded. And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face even as her rational mind insisted this was manipulation. This was cruelty, dressed in the costume of kindness. But Thomas pressed on with soft, relentless venom, suggesting that a duke did not marry companions, no matter how prettily they discussed poetry, that Frederick sought a mistress, not a wife, that Eleanor would find herself ruined and abandoned before the summer ended with nothing to show for her foolishness but a worn book of verses and the tatters of her reputation. And she wanted to rise and walk away, but her legs had turned to water beneath her skirts, and the poetry book trembled in her grip as all her carefully constructed hopes began to crack and splinter under the weight of doubts she had tried so hard to silence. And it was precisely at this moment that Frederick appeared in the doorway, his dark blue coat immaculate, and his expression shifting from warmth to sharp concern as he took in the tableau of his brother leaning so intimately toward Eleanor. And Thomas straightened immediately with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to presenting innocent faces to suspicious eyes, remarking cheerfully that he had merely been admiring Miss Ashworth's reading material. And Frederick's gaze moved to Eleanor's pale face and the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the book he had given her, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes before Eleanor rose on unsteady legs, murmured something about checking on Lady Pemberton, who dozed obliviously in the corner, and fled the room with Thomas's poisonous words echoing in her ears, and the terrible question burning in her chest of whether hope was just another word for foolishness when applied to a woman of her station and circumstances. Frederick found Eleanor in the portrait gallery an hour later, standing before the painting of his mother, with her arms wrapped around herself, as though she could physically hold together the pieces of whatever Thomas had shattered. And he approached slowly, his footsteps deliberately audible on the polished floor so as not to startle her. And when she turned at his approach, he saw that her eyes were red-rimmed, though her cheeks were dry, and the poetry book was pressed against her chest like a shield, or perhaps a wound she could not stop touching, and she immediately began to move past him with murmured apologies about needing to attend Lady Pemberton. But he stepped into her path with a gentleness that belied the fury still burning in his chest at whatever his brother had said to put that haunted look in her eyes, and he asked her plainly what Thomas had told her, and she shook her head and would not meet his gaze, and he felt something crack open inside him at the sight of her retreating back into that protective invisibility she had worn like armor when she first arrived. And so he spoke the words he had been rehearsing for weeks, telling her that his brother was a liar and a manipulator who could not bear to see others happy, that whatever poison Thomas had poured into her ear was designed to hurt Frederick by hurting her, and Eleanor's laugh was brittle as she replied that Thomas had merely reminded her of realities she had foolishly allowed herself to forget, that dukes did not marry companions, that men of his station took women like her as mistresses if they noticed them at all, and the word mistress on her lips sent a bolt of something like pain through Frederick's chest, because he realized with sickening clarity exactly what his brother had suggested, and he reached out and took her hand before she could pull away, feeling the worn leather of those gloves he had noticed so many weeks ago at Thornhill Manor, and he told her with a fierceness that surprised them both that he had never in his life considered her anything so degrading, that from the moment she had walked out of that library with tears on her face and dignity in her spine, he had been unable to stop thinking about her, that he had spent weeks investigating what had truly happened that night, and had learned of her innocence and his own shameful rush to judgment, that every conversation in his library and every walk in his gardens had only deepened his certainty that she was the most remarkable woman he had ever encountered, and Eleanor stared at him with something like terror in her eyes as she whispered that he must not say such things, that hope was a luxury she could not afford, and Frederick tightened his grip on her hand and replied that he was not offering her hope, but a promise, that he intended to court her properly and openly, and that anyone who objected, including his brother, could go to the devil. And the portrait of his mother gazed down at them with painted serenity as Eleanor searched his face for deception and found only earnest determination. And somewhere in the house, Thomas watched from a shadowed doorway, with fury twisting his handsome features into something ugly, and began to plan his next move. The morning of April 19th dawned bright and clear, as though nature itself had decided to mock the turmoil that churned beneath the polished surface of Ravenscroft Hall, and Eleanor woke to find that Frederick's declaration in the portrait gallery had not been a dream conjured by desperate longing, but a reality she must now somehow navigate. And she lay in her bed with the blue curtains filtering soft light across the coverlet, and wondered what it meant to be courted properly and openly by a duke when she was nothing more than a companion with worn gloves and a single trunk of books to her name. And when she descended to breakfast, she found the household already buzzing with attention she could not immediately identify until Mrs. Whitmore appeared at her elbow with a warning whispered beneath the clatter of silverware that Mr. Thomas had been making insinuations to the other guests about Miss Ashworth's character and the Duke's unfortunate susceptibility to scheming women, and Eleanor felt her fragile hope shudder under this news, even as she straightened her spine and entered the breakfast room with the careful dignity that had become her armor. And she saw immediately that something had shifted in the way the guests regarded her, because Lady Greville's peacock feathers trembled with barely suppressed excitement, and the young heiress Thomas had been pursuing looked at Eleanor with something between pity and contempt, and Frederick was not yet present. But Thomas sat at the table with a satisfied expression that made Eleanor's stomach clench with dread, and she took her usual seat near Lady Pemberton, whose cough had worsened overnight, and whose kind eyes showed concern at Eleanor's pale face. And Thomas raised his coffee cup in mock salute, and remarked loudly enough for the table to hear that his brother seemed to have developed quite the fascination with literary ladies of late, though such fascinations rarely lasted beyond the first frost, and before Eleanor could respond or flee. Frederick appeared in the doorway, still wearing his riding clothes, and his dark hair wind-swept from an early morning gallop, and his eyes swept the room, and found first Eleanor's stricken face, and then Thomas's smirking one, and something cold and dangerous settled over his features as he strode to the head of the table and remained standing rather than taking his seat. And in a voice that carried the absolute authority of a man who commanded vast estates and ancient titles, he announced to the assembled company that he had a matter of some importance to share, that Miss Eleanor Ashworth had done him the honor of permitting his courtship, that he intended to make her his wife, and that anyone who had difficulty accepting this fact was welcome to depart Ravenscroft Hall at their earliest convenience. And the silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear Lady Greville's sharp intake of breath and the soft thud of Thomas's cup hitting its saucer. And Frederick's gaze found hers across the room, filled with a fierce tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. And she understood in that moment that he had chosen to make his declaration public and irrevocable before his brother's poison could spread further. And Lady Pemberton reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand beneath the tablecloth with a joy that suggested she had suspected this outcome long before Eleanor herself had dared to dream it possible. The hours that followed Frederick's announcement passed in a blur of whispered consultations and barely concealed astonishment as the guests of Ravenscroft Hall attempted to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they believed they knew about dukes and companions and the immutable boundaries between them. And Eleanor found herself moved through the day as though in a dream, Lady Pemberton's delighted chatter washing over her like warm rain, while Mrs. Whitmore appeared at intervals with cups of tea and meaningful glances that suggested the household staff had been hoping for exactly this outcome. And Thomas had vanished immediately after breakfast with a face like thunder, his departure noted by Frederick with grim satisfaction, though Eleanor caught the flicker of something like sorrow beneath his stern expression, because Thomas was still his brother despite everything, and by afternoon the house party had begun to fracture along predictable lines, with Lady Greville holding court in the yellow drawing-room, where she proclaimed to anyone who would listen that she had always suspected there was more to Miss Ashworth than met the eye, while simultaneously implying that the Duke had clearly lost his senses to grief over his father's death. And Eleanor escaped to the rose garden, where the buds were finally beginning to unfurl their petals in shades of cream and pink and deepest crimson, and she stood among them, breathing in their faint sweetness and trying to make her heart believe what her mind still struggled to accept. And it was there that Frederick found her an hour later, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he approached with Caesar trotting at his heels, and he stopped beside her and said nothing for a long moment, simply standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cool spring air. And then he spoke quietly about how his mother had planted this garden when she first came to Ravenscroft as a young bride, how she had told him once that roses required patience and care, and would reward both with beauty beyond imagining, and Eleanor understood that he was speaking about more than flowers, and she turned to face him with all her fears and hopes naked in her eyes, and asked him why. Why her? Why a woman with nothing to offer but a sharp tongue, and a love of books, and a reputation now thoroughly shredded by gossip? And Frederick reached out and took her hand, removing her worn glove with deliberate care so that his fingers could intertwine with hers, and he told her that he had spent 32 years surrounded by women who wanted his title and his fortune and his lands, who performed prettiness and demureness, and all the qualities society demanded while hiding ambition and calculation beneath their painted smiles. But she had stood in that library at Thornhill Manor with tears on her face and fire in her spine, and had refused to beg or grovel or perform, had simply told the truth once and walked away with her dignity intact. And that single moment had haunted him for weeks, until he understood that he had witnessed something rare and precious, and that he would be the greatest fool in England if he let it slip away. And Eleanor felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill down her cheeks as Frederick lifted her bare hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that undid her completely. The days that followed Frederick's declaration in the rose garden unfurled like the petals of the flowers surrounding them, each one bringing new evidence that Eleanor's life had shifted irrevocably from the grey existence she had known into something bright and terrifying and wonderful. And she found herself moving through Ravenscroft Hall with a constant sense of unreality as servants who had barely noticed her before now curtsied deeply and addressed her with careful respect, as guests who had whispered behind their fans now sought her opinion on matters of poetry and music and garden design. And through it all, Frederick remained steadfastly at her side, his stern public demeanor softening whenever his eyes found hers across a crowded room, his hand finding excuses to touch her elbow or her shoulder or the small of her back with a proprietary tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. And Lady Pemberton had taken to watching them with misty eyes and frequent exclamations about how she had always known Eleanor was destined for great things. Though in truth the dear woman had known nothing of the sort, and had simply loved Eleanor with the uncomplicated affection of a kind heart. And even Mrs. Whitmore had begun treating Eleanor with a warmth that spoke of genuine approval rather than mere professional courtesy, appearing with trays of Eleanor's favourite biscuits, and ensuring that fires were always lit in whatever room Eleanor might wish to occupy. And yet beneath all this new-found warmth, Eleanor could not entirely silence the voice that whispered she did not belong here, that Frederick would wake one morning and see her clearly, and wonder what madness had possessed him to choose a penniless companion over the dozens of beautiful, wealthy women who would have accepted his hand with far more suitable credentials. And it was on the evening of April 21st that this fear nearly overwhelmed her when she descended to dinner wearing her blue dress for the 4th time that week, and caught Lady Greville's knowing smirk and the young heiress's pitying glance at her limited wardrobe, and she felt suddenly small and shabby and utterly out of place among the silk and jewels and generations of breeding that surrounded her, and she might have fled back to her room had Frederick not appeared at that precise moment and offered her his arm with a look that suggested he saw exactly what she was feeling. And as he led her into dinner, he leaned close and murmured that she outshone every woman in the room, and that tomorrow he intended to send for a modiste from London because his future Duchess would want for nothing. And Eleanor felt her eyes sting with tears, even as she whispered back that she had not said yes to his proposal. And Frederick smiled, truly smiled, with a warmth that transformed his stern features into something approaching boyish, and replied that he was aware of this oversight and intended to remedy it at the earliest opportunity. And Eleanor found herself laughing despite everything, because somehow this impossible man had seen past her grey dress and her worn gloves and her ruined reputation to the woman beneath, and she was beginning to believe that perhaps she deserved to be seen after all. The formal proposal came on April the 22nd, 1814, in the library that had become their sanctuary, and Eleanor would remember every detail of that evening for the rest of her life. The way the firelight caught the gold lettering on the spines of 1,000 books, the way Frederick's hands trembled slightly as he took both of hers in his grasp, the way his voice, usually so controlled and commanding, grew rough with emotion as he spoke words she had never dared imagine hearing from any man, let alone a duke of the realm. And he told her that he had spent his entire adult life believing that love was a fiction invented by poets to sell books, and that marriage was merely a transaction between families seeking to consolidate power and wealth. But she had shattered every cynical certainty he possessed simply by being herself, by refusing to perform or pretend or shape herself into what society demanded. And he knelt before her on the worn carpet of his ancestors' library and asked her to be his wife, not because she would make an advantageous match, but because he could no longer imagine facing the endless grey days of duty and obligation without her wit and her warmth and her quiet, stubborn courage beside him. And Eleanor found that all the words she had ever read in all the books she had ever loved had not prepared her for this moment when words failed her entirely, and she could only nod through her tears as Frederick slipped a ring onto her finger, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his mother. And then he rose and pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak and her heart pound against her ribs like a bird desperate for freedom. And when they finally broke apart, she laughed shakily and told him that she had imagined 1,000 futures for herself during her years as a companion. But none of them had looked anything like this, and Frederick smiled and wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, and said that was precisely why she was perfect for him, because neither of them fit the molds society had prepared, and perhaps together they could forge something entirely new. And later that night, when Eleanor lay awake in her fine room with its blue curtains, she touched the ring on her finger again and again, as though to convince herself it was real, and she thought about the girl she had been at Thornhill Manor just 5 weeks ago, exhausted and invisible, and certain that her life would continue in its quiet grey pattern until she grew old in service to others, and she marvelled at how completely everything had changed since a wrong turn in a dark hallway had led her to a moment of humiliation that had somehow transformed into the greatest blessing she had ever known. And she understood now that sometimes the path to happiness wound through valleys of pain, and that the woman she had become through her suffering was exactly the woman Frederick needed and loved. And when sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of roses in full bloom and a future bright with possibility. The news of the engagement spread through Ravenscroft Hall like wildfire through dry brush, and by breakfast on April the 23rd, 1814, Eleanor found herself the subject of every whispered conversation and sidelong glance as she entered the dining room on Frederick's arm. And she could feel the weight of 24 pairs of eyes assessing her anew, calculating her worth, reconsidering every assumption they had made about the quiet companion in the worn gloves and limited wardrobe. And Lady Greville's face had gone through a remarkable transformation from smug satisfaction to barely concealed fury as she realized that the woman she had spent weeks belittling was about to become one of the most powerful women in England, and Eleanor took a quiet, unworthy pleasure in watching the older woman choke on her tea when Frederick announced their engagement formally to the assembled guests, his voice carrying the same commanding authority he used for matters of estate business, as though daring anyone to object. And no one did, of course, because one did not object to a duke, not openly, though Eleanor could see the calculations happening behind carefully neutral expressions as guests reconsidered their treatment of her, and wondered whether she would remember their cruelties when she had the power to repay them. And Thomas was notably absent from breakfast, having departed before dawn according to Mrs. Whitmore, and Frederick's jaw had tightened at this news, though he said nothing, and Eleanor understood that the breach between the brothers had widened into something that might never heal, and she felt a pang of guilt for being the cause. Even as Frederick squeezed her hand beneath the table and murmured that Thomas had made his choices long before she entered the picture, and after breakfast, Lady Pemberton drew Eleanor aside with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and embraced her with surprising strength for such a frail woman, whispering that Eleanor had been like a daughter to her these past 3 years, and that she could not be happier if her own child had made such a match. And Eleanor wept too, because Lady Pemberton had been the closest thing to family she had known since her parents' deaths, and she had feared that her elevation would create distance between them. But the old woman laughed and said she expected frequent visits, and a room kept ready for her at Ravenscroft, and perhaps a godchild or two to spoil in her remaining years, and Frederick appeared at Eleanor's elbow and solemnly promised Lady Pemberton that she would always have a home with them for as long as she wished. And Eleanor loved him even more fiercely in that moment for understanding, without being told, that Lady Pemberton was not merely a former employer, but a cherished part of Eleanor's heart. And as the day progressed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers, whose sincerity varied considerably, but whose attention forced her to begin practicing the gracious demeanor expected of a duchess. And she discovered somewhat to her own surprise that she was rather good at it, that the years of observing society from its margins had taught her exactly how the game was played, And when Lady Greville approached with poisoned sweetness to offer congratulations, Eleanor smiled serenely and thanked her with perfect courtesy that left no opening for barbs, and Frederick watched from across the room with an expression of profound pride that warmed Eleanor from the inside out. The weeks that followed the engagement passed in a whirlwind of preparations and social obligations that would have overwhelmed Eleanor entirely had Frederick not remained steadfastly at her side through every fitting and consultation and endless stream of congratulatory callers. And she discovered that becoming a duchess required an education as rigorous as any university course, with lessons in household management from Mrs. Whitmore and instruction in precedence and protocol from a formidable dowager aunt who arrived unannounced and declared herself determined to ensure Eleanor did not embarrass the family name. And Eleanor bore it all with patience and quiet determination, because she understood that these skills were weapons she would need in the battles to come, for society had not forgotten the whispers from Thornhill Manor, and there were those who would forever view her as an upstart companion who had somehow bewitched a duke, and she would need every advantage to silence them. And through it all, Frederick watched her with an expression that mingled pride with something softer and more vulnerable. And in their stolen moments alone, he confessed that he had never imagined finding a partner who approached the challenges of their new life with such practical grace. And Eleanor laughed and told him that years of managing Lady Pemberton's household on a modest budget had prepared her well for managing a duchy. And he kissed her then with a fervour that left her breathless and counting the days until their wedding. And the ceremony itself took place on May the 15th, 1814, in the ancient chapel at Ravenscroft Hall, with spring sunlight streaming through stained glass windows that had witnessed Sinclair marriages for 300 years, and Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Whitmore had helped her select, simple and elegant, without the excessive ornamentation that would have made her feel like a costume rather than a bride. And Lady Pemberton wept openly in the front pew, while Frederick's formidable aunt nodded approval at Eleanor's composure and bearing. And when Eleanor spoke her vows, her voice was steady and clear, because she had never meant any words more completely in her life. And Frederick's hands trembled slightly as he placed the wedding band beside the sapphire engagement ring, and when they were pronounced husband and wife, he kissed her with such tender reverence that several guests later remarked they had never seen the cold Duke of Ravenscroft display such emotion. And at the wedding breakfast, Eleanor sat at the head of the table as Duchess of Ravenscroft, and looked down the long line of guests who had once dismissed her as beneath notice, and she felt not triumph exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that she had arrived at this moment not through scheming or manipulation, but simply by being herself. And Frederick caught her eye from his seat beside her, and raised his glass in a private toast that needed no words. And Eleanor knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with this man beside her, this stern and honourable man who had looked past every superficial measure of worth to see the woman she truly was. And as the celebration continued around them, she reached beneath the table to take his hand, and his fingers intertwined with hers as naturally as breathing. And she thought that perhaps this was what happiness felt like, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of someone who made every difficulty bearable.